It's friendly now.
It's been tamed. Very good. Good evening. Thanks very much for the invitation. Dave Duffy, I believe, is in beautiful Vienna right now as we speak, living the high life. So he's like a member. Thanks very much for the invitation. All right. The title I've given mine, Dr. Airy's good point about the title. I've called it the UN, a force for good and evil. I'll be covering the mainly the evil side. There's a conservative approach. But let me begin. I learned a lot from. Where's Dr. Airy's? Oh, I learned a lot. Thanks very much. I enjoyed your talk. It was good to be taken in hand and led through the structure and some of the functions, and I have to agree there's much being good that's been done. So my first point is to talk about the general benefits. If one is going to critique the UN, as I'll be doing tonight, it's only fair to begin with the benefits, and I'll be doing so very briefly, but they're very strong benefits. Just think what it offers. It's a forum for powers, many of them with nuclear weapons, and with industrial scale armed forces, to be able to talk before they fight. That must be an immensely valuable mechanism, a release valve. So peace and security, peacekeeping forces and so on, is very, very true. There are other roles of the UN, facilitating projects of mutual interest in health. Is that better? Want me to go closer?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Facilitating health, environment, development, international law. International law is also related to mitigating conflict, which I see is the UN's major role. These benefits serve all states' interests, and the fact is that if we did not, whatever one says about the UN, whatever criticisms one levels at, if we didn't have the United Nations, we'd have to create something like it, some sort of substitute, because it is so valuable. Now, I set myself the task of sketching some ideas about threats and potential threats of the United Nations. The first thing that occurred to me when I had a look at the members of the Security Council, here are the names in alphabetical order: Britain, France, Russia, China and USA. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Does anything strike anyone here about that? Does anyone detect a pattern?
Nuclear weapons.
Yes. Any others?
Powerful army.
Powerful
defence forces.
And
4 of the 5 are European. Based civilization, or countries, nations. Only 1 is non-European. There's not one from Africa, but Africa's a huge continent. There's not one from Central Asia, all those stands. There's not one. There's not one from South America. Obviously it's related to firepower, to sheer power, the size of their economies, whether they have nuclear weapons and so on. I understand that. But it strikes me as regionally imbalanced. The Near and Middle East, for example. And that gives those members, those permanent members of the Security Council, an opportunity to use the UN as a vehicle. It doesn't have to be a fatal vehicle, it doesn't have to be some evil intent, but just a self-interested vehicle. It gives, because they have that veto, they're better able to steer the UN and turn it into a vehicle. Maybe it's inevitable, perhaps it is inevitable, but it strikes me as one consequence of the regional imbalance. Danger too, so I'm running through a series of dangers, potential dangers. This is the potential one, and it's a proposal put forward by Bob Brown, who was the ex-leader of the Australian Greens, and he has a seriously thought through proposal to reform the UN, to turn it into a global parliament. It would have an upper house, so the current General Assembly would become the Senate. every state would be represented. By the way, it's not the United Nations, that's a misnomer. It's the United States of the world. Most of the members of the UN are not nations, so they don't pretend to be nations, they're states. Okay? So the upper house would consist of the current General Assembly. The lower house would be very different. The lower house would be elected, the number of delegates proportionate to the population. One person, one vote, one value, to use Bob Brown's term. So it would be a democracy in the demographic sense. And in fact, one of his leading goals is to create equality, global equality. It's one of his key goals. This structure would prefigure the UN as a vehicle for resource competition. This is my major criticism. It would prefigure it. It would structure it in a way to promote resource competition. Consider the logic. If Australia had one vote with our, is it 23, 24 million, India and China would have roughly 50 votes each in the lower house. Obviously, wealthy countries would be threatened by anything like a global democracy, and I doubt that the upper house, the Senate, would protect. But this is a potential. This is not the real UN, so I'll move on quickly. I just wanted to mention that because the global parliament, creating a global parliament, is actually in the minds of globalists, people who think globally, who think that we should not be parochial. The third danger, and this is getting close to my topic of interest, is hegemony of globalist ideology. Hegemony of globalist ideology. All states have a common interest in avoiding tyranny, that is, retaining sovereignty or autonomy. The UN is a vehicle of globalist ideology. It's many other things. There are many good works that it does. There are many. It's a representative place for nations, to states to represent their interests and so on. But it's also seen as a premier vehicle of globalist ideology. What do I mean by globalist ideology? Well, I mean globalism of the right, so corporate market ideology. There is a corporatist, multinational pool of where an ideology has developed, a shared culture that's critical of borders, for example, that's critical of parochialism, critical of anything that would impede the free flow of goods, services and population across borders. I call that right globalism. There's also left globalism, which is one could call utopian socialism, about the dignity of the equality and dignity of humankind and so on. Now, it seems to me that there is a self-serving and self-perpetuating organisational culture has developed in the UN, and it developed actually from fairly early on. It resides in the UN Secretariat with a budget of about $5.5 billion, which is not large, by the way. So the UN is not a wealthy organisation, given its responsibilities, but for $5.5 billion you can employ thousands of people. The UN University, did anyone not know that there's a UN University? It has campuses in many places around the world, several, a couple in Asia, several in Europe, one in America and so on. And this organisational culture is fed by the cosmopolitan ideology that is dominant in the social sciences and humanities in universities, in the university system. So this is an important fact of political life, that from the 1950s and then accelerating through the 1960s and 70s was a rising dominance of cosmopolitan ideology, especially in the leading universities, small parochial universities like the 2-year colleges they have in America. That's not so important, but the Ivy Leagues in America, Oxford, Cambridge and so on, are dominated by cosmopolitan ideology. By cosmopolitan I mean this criticism of parochialism, this notion of citizenship of the world, of brotherhood and sisterhood of mankind and so on. Now these are all these parts are mutually reinforcing, provide feedback between these sites of globalist ideology. The effect is to enhance globalism's prestige and influence. Danger 4, and I'll be coming back to this question of globalist ideology and the UN's role in it. Danger 4 is erosion of state sovereignty. Now this is happening through the use of foreign affairs powers to override domestic divisions of federal powers, and it's happening wherever you have national governments signing up and ratifying UN treaties. That then gives them power against the division of powers within that state. The Hawke federal government, the Australian example, is the Franklin Dam controversy that raged between 1978 and 1983. The Hawke federal government deployed its external affairs power to resolve the issue. Australia had signed, and here's the key point, Australia had signed the UNESCO Convention for the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage, a binding treaty. In a case before the High Court, the final case, it dragged on for years, the government argued successfully that it was obligated by foreign treaty to block the will of the Tasmanian electorate. Because the Tasmanian electorate at this stage was actually voting for the conservative side of politics. They didn't vote for the Hawke government. And the Hawke government said, well, actually we have no choice. We've signed this international treaty. We have to override states' rights. That has become a crucial precedent, and the High Court now routinely finds in favour of external affairs powers overriding states' rights. Danger 5, irrationality. This is something dear to my heart, being an academic. I'd like to think the world is somehow rational. Irrationality compounds the dangers of globalist hegemony and erosion of sovereignty. Why? Because it allows arbitrariness. Think about rational argumentation. The reason our common law tradition gives such weight to rationality and considered argument is that it tends to isolate, identify and weed out arbitrary rule. It's one of its great values. Now, the example I want to look at is the Racial Discrimination Act 1975. This was passed with the authority of the External Affairs Power in conjunction with the 1965 UN International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Titles, I could get lost in it somehow. But I'll cut it down to UNCERD. UNCERD. And whenever I say UNCERD, that means the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So Australia had one of the final acts of the Whitlam government in 1975 was to sign and ratify that convention, which made it binding, and had therefore, in fulfilment of its obligations, passed the Racial Discrimination Act 1975. UNCERD, this is the convention, UNCERD was the master document to the Racial Discrimination Act. So one can look at these documents as a master and a slave. Because we'd signed the international treaty, then we had the Racial Discrimination Act. The Act established the Australian Human Rights Commission, which has remained an influential, actually, body of, in the administrative sense, but also in the political sense. The goal of the Act is to restrict freedom of association and freedom of speech to protect citizens from ethnic discrimination. So it's a trade-off, right? If you have unfettered freedom of association, unfettered freedom of speech, then you can get acts of racism directed, that freedom being used. So as racial diversity increases, and all the proponents of this Act, of course, want diversity to increase. They want open borders. So as diversity increases, well, we have to take away freedoms. We have to take away freedom of association and freedom of speech. That's the cost of diversity. So there is a trade-off between liberty and diversity, typically in multi-ethnic societies. And the UN has been used to help resolve some of this tension. So now I'm going to run through, that's the first irrationality. Now I'm leading through an argument now about describing irrationality in a couple of United Nations documents. I'm now heading off. Irrationality 2. Civil liberties are suffering. So I've already implied that. The UN's rights agenda has helped generalise anti-discrimination ideology and make it more extreme. Now that's a thesis, and that's a hard thesis, so I'll be arguing for it. For example, in Australia, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, so there are different types of discrimination, is banned using language borrowed from the Racial Discrimination Act. Let's just consider the Tasmanian legislation, and Victoria right now is thinking of imitating the Tasmanian legislation. The Tasmanian legislation states that it is an offence to say or do anything that, quote, offends, humiliates, intimidates, insults, or even ridicules, unquote, due to sexual orientation, gender identity, or lawful sexual activity. Very strong, gives the courts tremendous leeway. Now, Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act says it's unlawful to, quote, offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate due to ethnicity or national origin. The only difference is the word ridicule. So Tasmania thought it would make it even easier to lock away or punish evil people who discriminate by making even ridicule actionable. 18C was used to prosecute journalist Andrew Bolt in that celebrated case. The Tasmanian Act against gender discrimination has been used against Catholic bishops. That's happening right now for teaching church doctrine on gay marriage. So now Catholic bishops religious leaders are being dragged into these commissions and say, hold on, you've broken the law. You've taught Catholic doctrine about that marriage is between a man and a woman. How sick can you be? What is wrong with you? Something that our civilization for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years and every other civilization has taken for granted. We're being prosecuted for it now. And we can trace this back in part to the United Nations, the influence of the United Nations. In part. Irrationality 3. These manifestations of anti-discrimination are extreme, so that's part of my thesis, that this is actually extreme. The UN contributes to the undermining of basic freedoms of association, we've seen that, of speech, we've seen that, and of religion. And it is arbitrary, because it's irrational. There's an irrationality there. For example, UNCERD, that's the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, legitimates the simplistic notion that ethnic discrimination, religious discrimination, indeed all discrimination, is antisocial and morally wrong. This is the message that comes from UN activists, from people who take their lead from the UN. Not all, I'm not blaming anyone present. Collective discrimination. Now here's the thing. If discrimination is this big bogey word, we live in the age of non-discrimination, it's evil to discriminate. The problem is that most private discriminations are pro-social and moral. Being human, we live by discriminating. It's part of human nature. We do it every day. Hundreds of times we make social discriminations. Some of those, quite often, are ethnic. Don't forget the Racial Discrimination Act concerns race, ethnicity, national origin. It's very broad. Okay? Now these are completely, and I'll be going into a little bit detail presently about how normal it is to discriminate, using the word technically, meaning differential treatment. Collective discrimination can also be moral. Discrimination is part and parcel of organised religion. A religion that doesn't discriminate basically doesn't do anything. Are you a member of the religion or not? Oh, discrimination. Can you come to the church? Well, are you coming to pray? No. Well, don't come in. Oh, discriminating. They have beliefs, very strong beliefs, that they believe came from God. States are morally free to choose immigrants to suit domestic conditions. They discriminate every day. Irrationality 4. The UN's opposition to discrimination is inconsistent. The UN actually promotes racial discrimination only for favoured races. For example, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, I like to shorten this into UNDRIP, of 2007. This was signed by the Gillard government in 2009. The Howard government had refused. They said, what? We're not going to sign. This is a crazy document. Though Ray refused to sign it. But Julie Gillard, she put a pen to it, 2009. That became the master document for the campaign to recognise Indigenous peoples in the Australian Constitution. Very similar language between the master document and the slave document or subject document. UNDRIP's racism, because it's really what I'm accusing UNDRIP, this is the declaration against discrimination against Indigenous peoples. I'm accusing it of racism. It includes the following. Article 20. Article 20 states the right of Indigenous peoples to, quote, maintain and develop their political, economic and social systems or institutions, unquote. Article 23 declares Indigenous right to determine their development and priorities and to administer their health, housing and other economic and social programs, quote, through their own institutions, end quote. Articles 35 to 37. Taken together, they demand the ethnic autonomy for Indigenous peoples. Article 35. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine the responsibilities of individuals to their communities. So they have the right to tell members of the Indigenous community, this is your responsibility, this is your responsibility. Why? Because of their ethnic identity. Article 37 allows Indigenous peoples to recognise, observe and enforce treaties and agreements made with states. All these provisions entail differential treatment by ethnicity. For example, by forming corporate ethnic bodies that pursue their own ethnic interests. Indigenous peoples have the right, according to UNDRIP, to organise along ethnic lines, to pursue corporate ethnic interests, to build an autonomous ethnic state, or something close to it. How much have we got? 2 minutes.
Discrimination.
There's no mention, well it is, because there's no mention of Indigenous Europeans. The UN does not acknowledge that most European nations are Indigenous. Between 10 and 30,000 years they've been resident there. The lesson is that irrationality allows arbitrary discriminations, in this case against majorities and Western peoples. The UN condemns racial discrimination but also promotes it. Let's look at UNCERD, let's go back to UNCERD, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Article 1 defines racial discrimination as, now just think to yourself, before I read this, think to yourself, what does it mean to discriminate on the basis of race? Differential treatment. Differential treatment, that makes sense. But that's not the definition. It's differential treatment that infringes human rights in public life. Oh, that implies that most discriminations are okay, because they don't infringe human rights. So you've got this dialectical playing with words. You take a normal word that's in the dictionary, that's used in the street, everyone uses it, they just redefine it. The fact is that association by ethnicity, nationality, culture, religion is normal in private and in public. Around the world, people are sought in marriage, friendships, business clubs, and people discriminating all the time. Australian ethnic groups also. US housing is as segregated now as it was in 1950. That's what people want. That's a human behaviour.
Yeah.
It is a human universal, the UN. So when the UN says discriminate, it does not mean discriminate. It means something tiny, something esoteric that almost doesn't exist. Here's the point. It will be clarifying and less destructive to rename UNCERD something like the UN Convention on the Elimination of Criminal Racial Discrimination, or perhaps the Convention on the Approval of Most Forms of Racial Discrimination. That will be honest, that will be accurate, using the word discrimination as it actually is meant. Now, I'm over time. When a question comes up, I'll give my last two slides. Okay, will I end there?
Yep.
Okay, thanks very much for your time.